Can we start? Yes? Okay. People told me that we are on, so I guess, let's just start. So good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome all of you to this event, which is the third event that we are promoting in this distance learning format. And also, this is the last event of this year for our research group, which is AQUILES research group, right? So for those who don't know me, my name is Priscila, and together with Leo, who is here with me, we will be mediating today's Tblt at issue online discussion. And I would like to start by thanking everyone for being here. So everyone who is attending this online event and reserving some time to actually learn and discuss some with us such relevant and interesting topics. And also would like to thank very much all the members of our research group for all the time, dedication, and effort that you guys have been putting in all of the events that we have carried out so far. And these events would definitely not have happened without you. So thank you very much for everyone. And a very special thank you for our guest, who is Dr. Nicole Ziegler. And who I had the pleasure to meet back in 2016 when I took her class on Tblt when I was in my postdoc PhD sojourn at Manoa, and who kindly accepted to be here today and share some of her expertise with us. So we will be introducing her very soon, but I would like to start by saying thank you very much, Nicole, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yay. So before we actually begin, I'm going to explain how this is going to go about today. It's actually going to be very similar to the other two events that we have promoted during this semester. The main topic that we are going to be discussing is task-based language teaching. In our first event, just to recap, we reviewed some important principles of Tblt, and we also talked about the Brazilian scenario in the field. So for those who are interested in these topics, you can take a look at the discussion that is saved here in the YouTube channel, PPGI YouTube channel. Also in the second event, we continue the discussion on Tblt, but then we focused on technology since it's such a relevant aspect of second language teaching and learning, and especially nowadays with the pandemic and remote learning. And then today, in our third event, we are going to be closing this year's talks by reflecting a little bit upon some recent perspectives in the field of Tblt, and also making some considerations about future directions in the area. Also, similar to our events, our other events, the idea is that we have a discussion in a more, let's say, informal fashion. So it's basically a conversation. And the reason why we are choosing this kind of format is because we as a group believe in the relevance of co-construction of knowledge, constructing knowledge collectively through dialogue. So we believe this is a very interesting way of going about carrying out this discussion. So then in the first part of our event, we are going to be asking some questions to Nicole. And then we are going to be talking about possibilities that are going to be deriving from these questions. Also following the tradition that we started in the other two events, we try to bring an element of surprise to our audience. So in the first event, we had the presence of two guests that carried out a debate. And then in the second event, we had testimonials from a school teacher and a school student. And then the guests, they reacted to the testimonials. And then today, the idea is that we try to bridge theory and practice. So we are going to be, one of the questions that we're going to be asking is going to be about a task. We are going to bring an example of what a task is. And the idea is that we discuss some implications of adapting this task to remote learning. And then in the end, we are going to be receiving questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please post in the YouTube chat. And then one of our members is going to be collected. And in the end, we are going to be asking these questions to Nicole as well. So I guess we can start, but before we start, Leo is going to be introducing our guest.
Okay, so thank you very much for being here with us, Nicole. It's such a pleasure to have you, even if in this distant mode. So I'd like to introduce you before we start with the questions. So Nicole is a professor at the University of Hawaii. She holds a master's degree in teaching English as a second language from Northern Arizona University, and she has a PhD in applied linguistics from Georgetown University. One of her main interests is task-based interaction and the role of corrective feedback in language learning. Most of the courses that she teaches at the University of Hawaii deal with teaching ESL grammar, classroom research, and task-based language teaching. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation and sharing your thoughts on TBLT with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to our discussion and for the surprise questions from the audience.
Yeah, so we are all looking forward to it. And then, let's start with the first question, shall we? Okay, so I would like to start by discussing an aspect of TBLT that is crucial for TBLT to work in practice, the idea of the needs analysis process. So as Mike Long discusses in his 2015 book, the first step in a language teaching course design is or should be to conduct a needs analysis. Long also points out the idea that the learner-centered approach needs to acknowledge individual and group differences and also account for learners' needs in relation to their contexts and realities. So in this sense, Nicole, could you elaborate a little bit more on the relevance of the needs analysis process on course design and material development from a TBLT point of view? And also a second question, if we consider, the fact that we have many teachers attending this event, and then they may be asking themselves, okay, but how do you actually go about investigating this context? How do you conduct a needs analysis, right? So if you could mention some aspects that can or should be considered, should be addressed in a needs analysis process in terms of instruments, procedures, so on and so forth.
Great. Thank you so much, Priscilla and Leo. First of all, thank you for everyone, out on the YouTube channel. Of course, I can't see you, but welcome. So this is such a great question. And this is something that when Priscilla was with us at UH, it comes up in the classes I teach on TBLT all the time. And so many of you as teachers are probably already doing a little bit of a needs analysis, maybe even unaware that you're doing it. So just to start off, a needs analysis can look like many different things. And even when you're just kind of surveying your students about what their interests are and what their goals are, just casually, that's even a little bit of a needs analysis. So I want to start with the idea that a needs analysis may seem kind of like a big, intensive, scary thing, but it doesn't have to be. And you can, of course, invest as many resources as you have available, but it can take many forms. So we'll get into that a little bit more. I guess I'm working backwards already from your questions. So why should we do a needs analysis? So let's start with the idea is that a needs analysis kind of allows us to really focus in on some of the central tenets of TBLT. So you guys have been talking about TBLT a lot. You're experts in what those central tenets are, so I won't take too much time on those. But really it allows us to focus our class in a way that's more individualized, right? That takes into account learner and group differentiation. As experienced teachers, you all know that every class is different, right? Even if you sometimes have the same students in classes, the way that they interact together, the way that that community forms is different from time to time. It can be influenced by many factors beyond your control. So it's important to consider that when we're teaching a new class that we do want to have some level of individualized approach. Otherwise, we can end up with sort of a one size fits no one approach to teaching. And Priscilla may remember J.D. Brown, one of my colleagues from UH Manoa, who recently retired. And one of his specialties was English for specific purposes. And one of the things that he used to say is that if a course isn't for a specific purpose, it's for no purpose. So if we don't have the specific needs of our students in mind, we may end up not really having any needs in mind. So by conducting a needs analysis, it allows us to target the needs of our students to make sure that we are able to best allocate the resources that we have to helping students meet their goals, connects their real world tasks to the classroom. So oftentimes students can feel disconnected from the things they do in a more traditional structural syllabus, a more grammar focused class. That may be an experience that you had as a language learner. Certainly, I did not experience a task-based language classroom when I was learning my second languages. There was very memorize these verb conjugations and practice these memorized dialogues, right? And so it didn't really meet my communicative needs as a learner. I was learning, in country, in the target language country, and I was able to memorize vocabulary words, but I couldn't buy a train ticket. And so my class wasn't meeting my needs. And the course I was in was full of people like me who were trying to work in country and, kind of survive. And so our class didn't meet our needs. Okay. And so a needs analysis is a really necessary first step in understanding how we can serve the needs of our learners. So the takeaway on that point is that in order to be the most effective teachers that we can, we need to know what our students need to learn in order to meet their personal and professional goals, whatever those may be. And if we don't conduct some sort of needs analysis, then we don't know what their needs are, and our efficacy as instructors is constrained. It's hampered because we are sort of just basing our things on intuition or previous experience, which may or may not really be relevant to our particular class. So I'll pause there. I have some other points, but in case we want to discuss that further, Leo and Priscilla.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very nice that you point out that there are many ways of conducting needs analysis, and sometimes we do that more, let's say, intuitively. We don't know we're doing it, but I mean, if we're thinking about our students, we are doing needs analysis, but we can go deeper if we have the knowledge on how to do it and how to go about it, right? So the second question we would like to ask you, now that we have covered the idea of needs analysis, has to do with frameworks for task implementation. So we have different contributions from well-known scholars such as Skian, Willis, and Willis, who have proposed frameworks for the implementation of task-based language instruction. Skian's framework, for instance, from 1996, is still very much used nowadays. And he emphasizes the importance of having pre, mid, and post tasks as a way to minimize difficulties in learning a language and of promoting improvements on language production. So, Nicole, we would like to know what are some recent reflections or perspectives when it comes to frameworks for Tblt implementation. So we're moving now from identifying the needs of our students and then coming up with tasks or cycles of tasks, but then how do we go about implementing them?
Great. So again, a great question. Thank you. And so when we think about frameworks, if we're thinking about how needs analysis is our first step, right? The frameworks really address how we're going to design the tasks. And so just returning very briefly to our previous question, for those of you in the audience, when you're thinking about what a needs analysis might look like, there's a number of different ways you can collect that information, inductive versus deductive methods, sampling expert and non-expert opinions, including other teachers and your students. It's not just the students necessarily. It can be interviews, both structured and unstructured, questionnaires or surveys, observations, journals, logs, ethnographies, tests. And the reason I bring those all up is because the purpose of the needs analysis, of course, is to identify those target tasks. So what is it that students need to know in your class to help them meet their goals? So when they are outside of the classroom, what is it they need to know how to do with the language? So now, once you have those target tasks, what do you do with them? How do you actually teach them in the classroom? And this is something that I think can be quite challenging for practitioners and for researchers, not just for practitioners, to take the identified tasks, which sometimes can be large, like get a job, for example, or job interview. You know, what does that actually contain? Well, it might include writing a CV, answering and asking questions, you know, preparation. And so breaking those things down into what we call pedagogic tasks, which are what you actually do in the classroom. And so once we have done these steps, we've done our needs analysis, we've identified our target tasks, we've come up with our pedagogic tasks. Well, then how do we organize them in the classroom? And that's where these different frameworks come in. And there's a number of different frameworks. So you mentioned Skian and Willis. And, you know, of course we have, you know, Long's frameworks, which is, he's a little more of the pure Tblt perspective, I suppose, the big Tblt perspective, which is how he refers to it in his text. And we have Peter Robinson, the Cognition Hypothesis as another approach. Rod Ellis has another framework, 2003, if you're interested in looking at that. So along all these different frameworks, I sort of think of them as on a continuum. So we have frameworks that are much more pedagogically oriented, like Willis and Ellis, that I think are more directed towards those in the classroom. And then we have those more on the research end, Skian and Robinson. So the Cognition Hypothesis, I think, is the most research focused of those frameworks. So when we think about these different frameworks, when we're thinking about how we organize tasks or how we design tasks and how we sequence them in the classroom, I find it's helpful to remind myself that, you know, human beings, we have a limited processing capacity. There's only so much we can do. And we've probably all felt the limits of that tested and these recent, you know, our move to online and Zoom, where we have multiple sources of input. We have visual, sound, but it's not face-to-face. So we're missing out on something that's tangible from our face-to-face interaction. And it's hard for us as humans to perform more than one task at a time, right? So research even suggests that, you know, multitasking actually makes us do all the things badly instead of doing them well. And so thinking about how we allocate our attentional resources is something to consider when we're thinking about the complexity of our tasks and how we sequence them. So in terms of these frameworks, in terms of recent perspectives, I think it's just my opinion, of course, but my opinion is that our field still looks at these and sees we have so much work to do. There's still so much that we don't really have a deep understanding of. So within our field, when we look at the research perspective, we have a relatively large body of research looking at task complexity from the perspective of Robinson's cognition hypothesis. Relatively large body of work there. We've seen a number of recent meta-analyses come out, synthesizing some of those results and what needs to happen next. And the majority of those studies have focused on manipulating task complexity along certain variables. So resource directing and resource dispersing. Have you guys talked about that in your research group? Is that okay? Awesome. So, you know, looking at things like the here and now, more or less elements, maybe a little less in planning time, multiple tasks, task structure, but then we don't see really as much in technology mediated Tblt, which you talked about previously in your last discussion. So we have a lot in face-to-face research, but those predictions are less understood in technology mediated Tblt. And what we have seen are the predictions that seem to be very consistent in face-to-face research aren't as consistent in technology-mediated research. So one of the recent perspectives in terms of the cognition hypothesis is that we really need to investigate it more in a technology-mediated environment, because things aren't happening the same way. Either learners don't behave the same way, or complexity doesn't impact learners' interaction and production the same way in a technology-mediated environment. Only a handful of studies really looking at that. So definitely an area that needs more exploration for those of you who are interested in research. Also, I think we need to have more investigations of task conditions and learner variables. So even though we all intuitively know, and we also know from research, how important individual differences are across learners, things like motivation, anxiety, willingness to communicate, working memory, although working memories receive some attention, familiarity, task familiarity, we don't have as much research in those areas. So I think we need to explore those topics more as well. There has been more research recently into task difficulty and also new methodologies. So Andrea Rivej, Mariah Michel have been doing a lot of interesting research looking at eye tracking, keystroke logging, stimulated recall, corpus linguistics, self-ratings, expert judgments, all kinds of different things to get a better understanding of, is what we think of as task designers and task researchers as a difficult or complex task, is it actually complex and difficult for a learner? So for a long time, we kind of just thought, well, it's complex because it's got more elements. So it definitely is. But it wasn't the case that learners always found it to be more complex. And so as more research in that direction takes place, that may help us to understand why the predictions of things like the cognition hypothesis maybe aren't playing out the same way in technology-mediated TBLT, because maybe those tasks aren't doing what we actually think they're doing. So some more explorations of validity. In terms of, as long as we're talking about technology-mediated TBLT, we may see the development of a framework, a more explicit framework for technology-mediated TBLT. Marta Gonzalez-Uret, one of my colleagues at UH, and Lourdes Ortega have done a lot of interesting work on technology-mediated TBLT and have proposed they have proposed what tasks in this environment should and could look like. So building on the work of Dowdy and Long and Ellis and previous experts in our field. And so we may see sort of an evolution there, I imagine, of maybe a framework that's adapted more specifically to this unique context that allows us to have predictions specifically for technology-mediated TBLT instead of trying to take something from face-to-face and making it fit into that new-ish, but now more ubiquitous context. So sort of a long-winded answer, I suppose, to say that, recent perspectives, I think, are that we are continuing to build on the knowledge that we have, but we're now starting to have lots of interesting opportunities for exploration in new areas, and we need to exploit those and really see what's there so we can get a better understanding of what is going on in the learner's mind and how we can give learners more and better learning opportunities as we're thinking about task sequencing and task design.
Very nice, Nicole. One of the things that comes to my mind listening to you has to do with this perspective that is more focused on pedagogical implications. You talked about the evolution, recent reflections on a research area, right? From a research perspective. And then when I look at these frameworks from a more pedagogical perspective, it seems to me that they may be really helpful, so then teachers can organize their tasks in a way and make sure that some scaffolding is being provided to learners, so then they can actually go about engaging in, doing whatever the task is proposing. Are there any recent evolutions or perspectives on this area as well?
That's such a great question. And, I think this kind of leads us into our next question. So a little bit of a spoiler alert that we're going to be talking about teacher training and teacher support, because I think that's something that's really challenging. And even though TBLT is a research-based pedagogy, there's still a little bit of a gap between what we're doing as researchers and then how do we actually get it into the classroom? So how do we make it accessible? And how do we help teachers understand what that looks like in the class? And I think in terms of our frameworks, that Willis and Ellis are more pedagogically oriented. And Willis has some, great, she's got a website, I forget the name, the URL off the top of my head, but she has a number of resources that are available. And so they're a little bit more step-by-step and, what does this look like and how is this integrated? And recently, there's an article by Melissa Baralt and Morcio Gomez that looks at kind of a step-by-step for online context. So again, getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but they have an actual task they've gone through step-by-step about how we could apply Willis and Willis's framework to a particular task in an online context. So I think we're seeing a little bit more interest perhaps in figuring out ways that we can make TBLT more accessible to the people in the classroom, the people who would actually be doing that work. And I consider myself an applied linguist. So the research that I do is designed to help us better understand how we can promote learning in the classroom. But at the same time, I'm publishing in places that are for other researchers, and I'm working with graduate students who will probably go into the field again in teaching, but there's still a gap between reaching out to practitioners. So again, very happy to have this opportunity today where we can connect with people who are teaching and have tremendous amounts of teaching experience, so we can make those connections a little bit more readily. So I guess the short answer is yes and no to in terms of the pedagogical pedagogical implications. I think our field is starting to take more interest in that, and we'll see hopefully more practical publications. Some of the big journals are starting to have more explicit focus on teaching and practitioners. So hopefully we'll see more direct applications on what, how do we actually apply the cognition hypothesis to the classroom, for example.
Right.
It isn't intuitive, as you know, right? And can be somewhat difficult. And I think we'll probably talk about that more in this next question about how we can maybe do that.
Right. And it's such a relevant way, to go, because if you think about it, I mean, many researchers, they're not saying this is my intention, right? They're focused on understanding the cognitive aspects of implementing TBLT. So that's understandable. But at the same time, we do have a lot of teachers interested in TBLT. So they would benefit a lot from, bridging this gap. So then we make sure that they are not just getting information from theory and then trying to apply into the classroom intuitively without actually understanding the theory, in practice as well. And as you mentioned, this is somehow related to the next question we are going to be asking. So Anna can put the question on the screen. And then the idea is that we go back to Martinez's 2016's article in which he discusses the role of the teachers in TBLT. And then East says that teachers' decisions and actions in authentic classroom practice may strongly differ from the prescriptions in the pedagogically oriented literature. So, and one of the reasons is probably, this gap between theory and practice. And one of the things that we have been discussing in our group actually is the fact that very little has been written about task pedagogy and teacher development from a practical point of view. So, reinforcing what you just mentioned. And then what happens is that commonly teachers either don't know how to implement TBLT, or they don't feel like the approach is possible to be implemented in their context. It feels like it's too difficult, or my context doesn't allow for this kind of approach, so on and so forth. So then, a little bit more on what could be done to facilitate task implementation or task design for teachers.
Great, thank you for this question. As we were talking a little earlier before we started, and this is something that comes up every time I teach TBLT, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot about personally, because as I said, this is an interest of mine. So the questions that I'm asking in my research are about how we can make interaction or technology, how we can facilitate learning in those environments. And so I find myself, in brief moments of self-reflection, thinking about, how we're doing all this cool research and we're learning about how tasks can be supportive, but does it really matter if teachers don't know how to do it? And so it's sort of like if a tree falls in the woods kind of a question. And so I think this is a real need. And we are seeing a slight increase in terms of the research conducted, looking or asking teachers and interacting with teachers and finding out what are the challenges in teacher training programs. So Laura Brafansky, who's at Georgetown now, she did her dissertation on a teacher training program in, I believe, Honduras. And, Xiaohong Han has a recent article, Martin East, of course, Chris Vanden Brenden. So there's a few scholars that are starting, and Laura Grzinski-Weiss, who are turning towards the teacher and thinking, okay, well, how can we help bridge this gap? The short answer is we need more support. We need more people reaching out, more support from our field, more outreach, more connections between researchers and teachers. And I was thinking about this the other day, and it shouldn't be that you have to go to grad school to have a really good understanding of TBLT. And that's kind of what it feels like, right? Like people kind of think, oh, what are tasks? And then you go to grad school and you have a whole semester or more on classes and you're like, oh, this makes sense. This is cool. Like this resonates with me. I'm going to do this. But then what about for the people that's not an option for? And it shouldn't be where you have to go do that. You should be able to, this should be an accessible pedagogy, because the whole idea behind it is that it's a research-based, psycholinguistically valid pedagogy. So we want to get it out into the hands of people. So this is something that is very interesting to me personally, and that I'm currently working on in a way to develop. This is perhaps one of the benefits, I shouldn't say benefits, one of the upsides to our current situation is that it allows us to do more outreach, more online work. So I'm currently interested in working on the development of teacher training, online teacher training, to kind of get these ideas of TBLT out to teachers and to provide both short and long-term support. So what does that look like? Well, what we know from research and from talking to teachers is that things that we need to help teachers have an understanding of, and this will make sense to all of you as teachers, is that as teachers, we sort of see ourselves as facilitators. And so if we take those same principles and apply them to TBLT, then we need to give teachers the tools to be able to take activities or textbooks and turn them into tasks. So what does that include? I believe that includes helping teachers understand the underlying concepts of TBLT. So why does it work? Because if you don't understand why it works, or you don't believe that it'll work, then it'll be very difficult to implement it into the classroom. So helping teachers, practitioners have a good understanding of what those underlying psycholinguistic concepts are. So negotiation of meaning, input, output, focus on form, corrective feedback, language-related episodes, all those things, and how we can create situations that encourage those things, right? So how we can create interactive opportunities to allow learners the space for learning to take place. So if we believe that learning takes place through interaction, then how do we create those interactive opportunities? And we'll talk about that again coming up with the adaptation of that task, right? So more to come, okay? Spoilers, everybody. So, the role of the teacher in the TBLT classroom it can be demanding. And I think this is something that maybe causes some teachers to hesitate. And this is what I've heard from graduate students and from teachers that I've talked to, is that it seems like a lot. And, you, as the teacher, you are the facilitator. So you're kind of trying to motivate the learner to invest intensive mental energy and task completion and drawing on their own linguistic resources, giving them the space to do that, and a place where they can trigger those different processes of learning that we talked about. So we need kind of a strong theoretical basis. And then I think it's also important to consider what TBLT isn't, because I think when people hear it described, it sounds sort of chaotic, right? So you're like, oh, people are going to be interacting in pairs and groups, and they're going to be talking. And for a lot of teachers, I think this sounds like, oh my gosh, this sounds like a nightmare, especially for kids or younger learners. How do you maintain control? How do you help learners learn in that environment? So I think helping teachers understand that that isn't necessarily what tasks are. Maybe it can look noisy or chaotic, but it doesn't mean it has to be that way. And there's still ways that teachers can maintain control in some sense, right? So it's not that you're losing control over what's happening. And there's different ways to support learners with different proficiencies or different participatory needs. So some learners, we all have learners that are very enthusiastic and have high willingness to communicate. And then we have learners who are more anxious and are less likely to. Oddly enough, I myself am a learner like that. I can remember from my classes in German as a second language, writing down everything I was going to say before I said it. So I was not particularly interactive. If things deviated from my plan, it was very stressful for me. And I did a very bad job of rolling with that. But I would have benefited from more interactive opportunities to kind of get past those barriers and to build confidence and to have opportunities to draw on my own linguistic resources. So even for learners that aren't participating, research does show us that even if they're just observing interactions of their peers, they still are getting those same developmental benefits. So there's still opportunities there. So I think we need to create opportunities for teachers to explore. And I also think there's a little bit of a sense in TBLT where it's sort of, I think sometimes it feels like it has to be all or nothing. Like if we can't have a really task-based class with our needs analysis and our task-based assessment, then it's like, well, why bother? It sounds like too much. It's overwhelming. And I think, I understand that. I was a teacher for a long time too. And, you're making lesson plans and you're communicating with students or parents, and you have your administrative duties as well and pressures. So there's a lot going on. And I think, as a TBLT proponent, yes, that's ideal. It would be great if everybody could have a task-based classroom with task-based assessment. But the reality of that is much more challenging. And I don't think it's not easily done for everyone, let's say. So task supported, where we have tasks brought in to support maybe a more grammar focused or structurally focused syllabus. Maybe teachers don't have the flexibility to really have a task-based approach entirely.
Or even, you know, it makes me think of the first question, because depending on the context, and like if you think about the Brazilian context, for example, if you think about public schools, you have specific needs that may be they might need to be addressed, that, you know, sometimes a more task supported perspective may fit better to the context than maybe like an ideal task-based language teaching, like all the way. And I think what you're saying is very important, because it relieves the pressure from teachers. So it's like, okay, if you don't think you can do a full course on Tblt, you can, you know, maybe include tasks in your syllabus, so then your learners' needs are met, right?
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, teachers now more than ever before, teachers are experiencing burnout and they're overwhelmed, right? And, you know, I certainly want to encourage, you know, anyone watching today to, if they're curious about Tblt, you know, to integrate it into the classrooms as much as they can. Exactly what you're saying. You know, it doesn't have to be this really intensive task-based experience. And like you said, we don't want to end up in a situation where we're imposing task-based when it's maybe not the right fit for the class. And so I think the aim is to move towards using tasks as much as is appropriately possible for your context. And I think that's a good thing. You know, if we're giving learners opportunities to interact in a way that we know can support and facilitate language learning, that's the goal. And it may look different in every class, and that's okay. One of the things we do know from research, this recent research that's been looking at, you know, teacher training, is that teachers often feel that, you know, they get a lot of theoretical knowledge, but not a lot of opportunities to practice what that actually looks like. And I think, you know, that's been my experience at conferences, talking to teachers. Maybe they've done one professional development workshop, you know, an hour or two in the afternoon, and then they're kind of expected, okay, now you know about tasks, like go do tasks. But afterwards, teachers are kind of like, what's a task? You know, like they're not totally sure what that.
How do you design one?
Yeah, exactly. It just raises more questions, right? So then we've got teachers who are like, okay, this kind of sounds cool, but how do I actually do it? You know, what does that look like? And so I think, you know, we have a few different resources, the Task Bank, which we'll talk about, IRIS, that are starting to collect tasks to make them more accessible to teachers. But again, I think it comes back to this idea that if we can, and this is something that I'm working on, again, create some support for teachers in terms of what does a task-based lesson plan look like, and, you know, feedback opportunities, a community where teachers can, you know, try out tools, resources, and get feedback on these different things. Reflection has been shown to be really important. So as teachers are maybe thinking about implementing this, sort of like action research, you know, seeing what works, what doesn't work over time and with their different contexts. But, you know, giving teachers more accessible training, more support in terms of connecting what we know from research and making it applicable to the classroom. So what does it actually look like? Helping provide support for lesson plans and, you know, task design. So task design is something that is not intuitive, I don't think. You know, you think, oh, okay, I'll make an interactive task, but then what does that actually look like? And we'll talk about that later with that task that isn't particular, it doesn't require interaction. So a lot of times things look tasky, but maybe don't require interaction. And there's a place for those as well. So not to say that that can't be beneficial, it absolutely can. But if we're trying to create interactive tasks, what does that look like? So, you know, more concrete resources or examples for teachers, more specific strategies, examples, techniques in accessible, easy to understand formats. So that's something I'm trying to slowly start working on in the professional development courses to make these accessible to teachers. So it isn't something where, you know, you have to get a whole degree just to understand how to do this in the classroom. If we believe that this is a pedagogical approach that supports learning, which I do, and I think probably many of you do as well, then it's in our best interest to get this out in the hands of people who can put it into the classroom. So, and that also helps us come back to our frameworks question. It also helps us know more about how things actually work and, you know, how they work in different contexts. So it's win-win all the way around as far as I'm concerned.
So I was thinking while you were talking about this, I was thinking about my practice, and maybe I would say that I'm more like a task-oriented teacher in the sense that I consider and I think about task Tblt principles, but then thinking about my context, my students, sometimes I decide not to use a specific task, or I not everything I do would be really a task when we think about the concept, the theoretical concept itself. But I try to come up with classes that would somehow be follow the principles of Tblt, because I understand how these principles may work and how they may help my students. So I think teachers also need to be able to experiment and also to understand how see in practice the benefits that adopting or implementing tasks would have in their real contexts, you know. So I think what you're saying goes in this sense. At the same time, one of my interests, and it's also Priscilla's interest, has to do with critical pedagogy, because I think as teachers, as educators, we're, as you said, we are facilitators. We're trying to help students develop their language knowledge, their linguistic knowledge. But at the same time, as educators, we understand that we should go beyond that. We're also preparing students or helping them, creating the opportunity for these students to act in the world, in society, to become active citizens, critical citizens, and so on. So it's in this sense that I would like to ask the next question for you. So if Anna could share with us. So we, as you said, Nicole, Tblt is a more cognitively oriented perspective, because it has a psycholinguistic rationale behind it, which helps us to understand how language learning takes place, yes, and it informs us our practice in this sense. But we could say that Tblt, at least in the way it has been researched so far, the majority of studies, we could say that it might lack a critically informed understanding of society. So it's hard to see tasks that focus on inequality, differences, lack of social justice in the teaching and learning contexts. So if we think about this imperative role of education in the development of critical citizens who can not only reflect but also act upon the realities, what would be the importance or the possibilities of a critical perspective on tasks? Is it possible to apply, implement, design tasks from a critical perspective? So do you think that task-based language teaching can somehow help us both promote critical development and language development, or rather critical language development? Is it congruent with a perspective that focuses on social justice? And if so, how?
So I think the short answer is yes. But with the caveat that, you know, as Leo mentioned, so my research is grounded in the interactionist perspective, the interactionist approach. So it's very cognitively focused. And something that often comes up in classes is that within this approach, we tend to look at learners as a group, you know, the group of learners, as opposed to the individual learner. And that's been an area that this approach has been criticized for. And, you know, that is a space where we can expand, absolutely. And so with that caveat that I am certainly not an expert in critical language pedagogy or critical approaches, but as you know, Graham Crooks and I are working on an article right now, sort of looking at what could be or should be the relationship between Tblt and critical language pedagogy. And so, you know, Graham really sort of brought this to my attention. You know, we've had some really interesting conversations about this. And I mean, the short answer is sort of, well, why not? Why couldn't TBLT work with critical language pedagogy? It seems like they would really be a great match, right? To me, it seems like there's a lot of potential for a reciprocal relationship there. So in talking with Dr. Crooks, one of the things that he's mentioned is that critical language pedagogy doesn't necessarily have a framework for teaching necessarily, right? Like a developmentally based framework. And so similar to how TBLT has informed technology mediated interaction and research, it's provided a framework, it's provided a structure and guidelines about what those tasks or interactions could look like. Similarly, TBLT, I think, can offer a pedagogical framework for a critical language approach or critical language pedagogy. So TBLT gives us a lot of information about how we can promote language acquisition, as well as how we can promote interaction. So that is something that can be helpful to a CLP perspective. In terms of what can CLP bring to TBLT, I think a lot. If we're thinking about what we're doing in the classroom, so we've maybe identified some real world tasks, but there's also critical aspects to that. Why can't the tasks have a critical take? In many cases, there isn't any reason why they couldn't. So if we're thinking about interactive tasks or topics, we're assigning readings, maybe students have to give a presentation. So maybe this is something that's been identified as a task. Maybe they're university matriculated students and they need to give a presentation. Well, why shouldn't the presentation be about something that has a more critical focus, that has that takes into account power structures or more social justice, socially oriented topics? So I think we could integrate more critically framed tasks into a curriculum. And to the best of my knowledge, there's very little research has done this. You two have done probably some of the only work on this in our field, and a little bit Konoda and Watanabe and Graham, of course, but it hasn't really been as well discussed a topic as I think it could be. And I think it's very exciting. So if we think about, why couldn't we use TBLT? Why can't we combine our powers, right, for good, and do things like looking at power inequities and other equalities, while at the same time promoting language development and performance? They seem to be a very good match. Perhaps one of the ways that this might, or one of the things this could look like, is a critical needs analysis. So kind of coming back to our initial question, we think about how TBLT really focuses on real world tasks. So maybe sometimes though, for certain instructional contexts, like Priscilla was mentioning, their needs may be non-specified or very specific. So a needs analysis maybe won't yield as much usable data as, say, a class for someone who is going to study in the US, for example. So then we maybe argue, or we could argue, that there's space there to expand the operationalization of what the needs are, or what the tasks could be, to include socially and critically oriented needs that aren't necessarily restricted to just using the L2. So we could ask learners about what they feel are interesting or critical topics in their lives, not necessarily L2 related, but just in general. So the example of Konoda and Watanabe, they looked at high school learners and just asked them, well, what's important to you? And one of the things that came up was this issue on bullying. And so they created a task to look at negotiation and trying to resolve, social interactions that lead to bullying. So they took something that was completely non-L2 related. So it wasn't just like, how are you going to use the L2, but it was related to their real lives, and it was very important to them and was a critical issue, and then just explored it using the L2, or a combination of the L2 and the L1 in this case. So if we're thinking about including a critical pedagogy perspective, it can be included as the needs analysis, looking at stakeholders like students, teachers, administrators, curriculum designers can maybe identify these issues that are important at large. Things that come to mind for me right now are things like climate change, political unrest, racial and social inequality, wealth inequality. There's a lot of things. These are, in the US context, of course, that are important topics that students are engaging with. Something that Graham and I talked about is, maybe helping students organize to participate in a peaceful activism. So making flyers or outreach, or, with our recent election in the US, you can't do anything with elections in the US, but, people wrote postcards. So for example, that is a writing task So it's just an example of a way that perhaps we can integrate more critical tasks into the classroom. I think there's a lot of possibilities for interfaces with technology, with TBLT. There's a lot of opportunities for a reciprocal relationship where TBLT can benefit and critical language pedagogy can benefit as well. Again, I'm not an expert in critical language pedagogy, so I'm sure you guys have some excellent ideas on what that could look like as well. So I'm very interested to hear your thoughts also on this question.
Yes, I think as you said, Nicole, critical language pedagogy doesn't have a framework, but at the same time, its elements or principles somehow can be seen as very similar to TBLTs because it's learner-centered. So we start from learners' needs, and the idea is that the classroom is a democratic space, so we promote dialogue, we interact, we share ideas, and we construct knowledge together. So I think these are some essential aspects that show how we can think about critical aspects in the task-based language classroom. At the same time, I think what is important here, again, is the role of the teacher, because the teacher will be the mediator. So the teacher needs to have in mind, what is my objective and what is my role as an educator? So am I just here to help students, I don't know, buy a ticket, or am I helping them reflect on how power relations work in the world so that some people get to travel and others don't, right? So I think this reflection in relation to both TBLT and critical pedagogy, I see this as very important in teacher training, you know, so I think this would be really helpful.
Yeah, and, you know, it has to do also with, you know, we go back again to making sure teachers have enough support to carry out their work. And then if we have this perspective, like Leo mentioned, and you also mentioned, if we understand language from a social perspective as well. So we understand that the way we use language has to do with the world, has to do with our role in the world, and it has to do with power relations. So it's not just, you know, language is not something that is there per se, but it has to do with the relations that we carry out among individuals, contexts, and so on and so forth. If we have this perspective, then the teacher is not going to be teaching language without considering the context. And then if we consider the context, sometimes teachers, they get this feeling, I believe, because, you know, I work with teacher training, and I have been an English teacher myself. And then what happens is that teachers, sometimes they feel like, okay, I don't know how to organize my classes in a way that is communicative, in a way that I am maximizing learning opportunities, in a way that I am helping my students to communicate and relating that to their needs. But at the same time, how do I do that, all that I believe is important, but also focus on things that are related to the students' contexts, and that are going to provide them the possibility to use the language as critical citizens, as citizens who are going to be changing their reality, who are going to be transforming their contexts, right? So yeah, I agree. I think, you know, the two areas, teachers may benefit from the two areas, and they should definitely be conversing.
And also because I think in research, we tend to look at things from one perspective because we need to control things, right? But when we think about the classroom, I mean, language learning is social and is cognitive at the same time. So I think when we bring those two areas together, or when we try to look at language learning in the real classroom from these broad perspective, I think we benefit a lot, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we think about like learners interacting in the classroom, and, you know, your point about research is such a great one, Leah. Like, you know, we're trying to look at maybe the impact of an intervention, or how does pre-task planning affect learner performance? And we're doing that, and learners are interacting with each other. And we can't say that those social factors don't have an impact at all. Like, I'm sure that it's not like, you know, they're not robots, and language doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like Priscilla was saying, it happens within a context, and, you know, a very complicated human context. And so it's difficult in terms of research to in one study to look at how all these things interact. But we can look at baby steps and look at things multiple times from multiple perspectives to help us develop a better understanding. And that kind of will get into, I think, the last question for today. We'll kind of come back to that idea. Yeah. So
Great.
Yes.
So we have, I'm sure everyone has noticed that we have been, pulling towards the idea of looking into the classroom, because we are very much interested as a group in, understanding language development, understanding how language acquisition works. But because, we are working with teachers, and we are helping teachers to develop their teaching practice. So we are very much interested in understanding all this process, thinking of teachers, right? So we've talked about needs analysis, we've talked about how to organize and design and sequence tasks, and recent perspectives on that. We've talked about critical tasks. But what happens, as we already mentioned, is that sometimes teachers don't even understand what a task is. Or also what happens a lot is that, as I think Nicole mentioned it before, teachers, they look at, they have materials, they have textbooks, or they have, websites, things like that, with many different English activities for teaching language, not necessarily English. But then they think, okay, how can I adapt this to my context? Or how can I transform this into a task, right? So thinking of these issues, we thought that it would be interesting today to actually bring an example of what a task could be looking like. And then, talk a little bit about these aspects, talking a little bit about the interaction aspect, because it's such a relevant aspect, principle in the TBLT field. And then also try to bridge that, thinking about the remote learning. So Anna is going to be sharing here on the screen the example that we brought, and then we are going to be describing it a little bit first, and then after that, we come with the question. So let me just make this bigger so I can see it better here. Okay, so here we have an example of a task which we took from this TBLT Language Learning Task Bank, which is this website that it's really interesting because it's gathering examples of tasks from all over the world. It doesn't have to be tasks to teach English, it can be to teach any language, right? So if you have any tasks that you think it would be interesting for other people and you want to share, you can try to send it, and they're going to be giving you feedback and maybe even posting on the website. But anyway, this task specifically was designed for Spanish learners. And the idea here is that the student looks at himself or herself as an au pair, which is kind of a babysitter. I've been an au pair myself. So basically you live in, cool. So you live in someone's house and you take care of the children. And then you also have the opportunity to study and interact with other people. It's a very interesting program. But anyway, so the idea is that the student takes the role of an au pair who has to listen to a voice message that was left by the host mother. And the voice message is about making a shopping list for school supplies and also considering the prices. So the kids need school material and you have to buy them, but you have to make the list first and then consider, what does each kid need and how much does it cost, so on and so forth. And then also the au pair is going to be receiving an envelope with 150 pesos. And the au pair needs to decide if the money is actually enough to buy all the supplies that are needed or not. So this is the task, right? And then if we go to the next slide, the idea here, we would like to briefly try to understand why this is a task, actually. So, among many different aspects that would make a task, but if we take Alice's understanding of what a task is, one of the most important aspects for this kind of activity is that it focuses on learners' primary focus of attention. It focuses learners' attention to meaning making. So the idea is that learners are going to be thinking about the message, the communicating intention, or here, for example, the idea is that the learner is going to be focused his or her attention in understanding the message from the voice message and using the information to make a list. right? It also, another characteristic that is important in a task is that it has an outcome to be achieved. And by outcome, we mean a communicative result, something that's going to be done with language. So here, for example, the au pair has to, the student has to complete the list. That's an outcome, but also is going to use all this information with a purpose, because in the end, the student has to make a decision. Is it enough money or not to buy everything that is needed? So you listen to the voice message with a purpose in mind, right? And also it involves cognitive and linguistic abilities from the real world. So if you think about our daily life, we are always making lists. We listen to voice messages constantly. We normally make decisions, right? We have to decide if we have enough money or not to buy things. So these are abilities that we develop in the real world. And then the idea is that the task is always resembling the world of the learners, right? So these are some of the reasons why this would be considered a task. However, this example specifically does not necessarily require interaction among learners, because as we can see, you can do the activity individually, which is okay. You don't have a task doesn't have to be an interactive task, right? But we do know that interaction is very interesting, and it may learners may benefit a lot from interacting with peers, interacting with teachers in order to develop language. So considering all that, we are going to be making two questions deriving from this example. So the first one is, based on all of this, what would be the benefits of incorporating an interactive component to this task? And if that is even a possibility, how would that happen? How would you do that, Nicole? Or how could that be done if we wanted to transform this task into a more interactive task? And also, considering the current situation that we are living in with remote teaching and learning, what recommendations would you make for teachers who are interested in promoting interaction while using tasks? And considering the fact that it's not so easy to interact when you are far away, you know, physically at least. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this is such a great example. And, you know, the Task Bank, so Laura Gazinski-Weiss from Indiana has started this and has made this an initiative. And it's one of the things that we hear a lot about is that there's not, it's hard to find tasks. Like, where do you find tasks? And so this is a great opportunity to get tasks out into the hands of people who want to use them. So with that in mind, this is such a great example because it meets a lot of task parameters, and it's a listening task, right? So it's a task where learners can practice their listening comprehension. And, you know, as you went through, it meets a lot of the parameters of a task. It has situational authenticity. It has a lot of good points. But why would we want to make this an interactive task? Well, so all of the reasons that we know interaction can be beneficial for learners. So there's opportunities for negotiation, opportunities for, you know, feedback provision, for noticing then, for modified output, for pushed output, and then for language related episodes. And we know from research that all of those things are not necessarily developmentally beneficial, but they provide opportunities for learners to acquire knowledge, right? To restructure their interlanguage and improve their performance. So that's probably the biggest argument, right, for making this an interactive task, is to give learners those opportunities that they wouldn't have if the task remains the same as an independent task. Okay, so in terms of task design, I thought about, you know, well, how could this be adapted to be a jigsaw task, for example? So one of the things that Ellis also talks about, and Skian as well, is that, you know, a task can have a communication problem. So something that needs to be solved, where they have to work with another student in order to resolve that issue. So in this case, I think this could be famous last words, right? Relatively easily adapted to be a jigsaw task where learners would receive slightly different information, where there's a gap, where they need the information of the other learner. Maybe, I actually thought, so in this task, right, it's designed for the teacher to read the voicemail, at least in the instructions, right? And so, which I think is, you know, fine, but also introduces some other potential challenges. You know, when we, at least in my experience, when I read something more than once, I don't necessarily read it the same way every time. Maybe I put emphasis in, you know, places, or I speak fast or slow. So there's also other, which, you know, is representative of how people talk. So that's not an issue, but it's something that, adds another layer. So I think one of the ways that we could adapt this as educators would be to pre-record the voicemail message. And this also adds the additional benefit of being perhaps more ecologically valid. So when we listen to voicemail, it's not somebody reading a script, it's a recording, right? That's what a voicemail is. And so making recordings for the learners to listen to. This would also allow us to adapt that task. So breaking it up where we could have two different learners, maybe one has prices, one doesn't, possibly. Maybe they have different items and different needs. So maybe they are working for two different families or the same family and they're sharing a kitty, they're sharing amount of money. Maybe they have to go get supplies for, multiple children in this case, which is what's included in the task. It reminds me of a task by Inigo Yanguas from his 2012 article, and that we've adapted and used our own research on The Amazing Race. Did you guys have the show in Brazil at all? It's kind of old now. It makes me feel really old because it was very popular 10 to 15 years ago. And it seems like just yesterday, this was such a cool show. But the idea is basically that there was teams of people and they would fly around the world and have adventures and sort of be racing through these adventures, and they'd have a certain number of resources. So this task that Inigo created, learners have different sheets with different items and amounts of money, and they have to decide what they need I think in this case, it's like a rainforest adventure. So they need a rain jacket, a water purifier. So you could do something similar with this task where learners have different information and they have to work together to figure out what they need. And spoiler alert, right? There's never enough money, right? A common thing that we all are familiar with. There's never enough funds to buy all the things we want. So this would be, I think, a good way that we could adapt this task to enhance maybe the ecological validity of the task, to provide more flexibility, and also to provide those interactive negotiation opportunities. So that's, I guess, the answer to the initial question. In terms of how do we promote interaction in online learning? First, let me start off by saying it's hard, right? It's really hard, and I totally get it. And it's something that, I am also finding to be challenging, doing everything online. And so a lot of colleagues are like, oh, this is your area. You do technology. What's changed for you? I'm like, well, in some ways, nothing's changed because I can still do my research. But then everything has changed in other ways. And so, here on Zoom, we're still able to interact in a way that actually video chat has hardly any research on it because hardly anybody was looking at this before all of these things happened. So we have, a handful of studies, less than 10 studies looking at multimodal video chat. So I predict that we will see much more in the future. But, using Zoom is a great way to promote interaction in these online environments. And one of the things that can be tricky is luckily Zoom has these breakout rooms now, right? Because when we have everybody, and it's just a few of us here today, which is great, but I'm sure we've all been in situations where there's 20 people on our Zoom call, and it's really difficult as learners, as teachers, to interact in that capacity. There's so much information, and we talked about how we as humans have limited attentional capacity, and that really kind of pushes us, to the limits because there's so many things to focus on. So using the resources of technology like breakout rooms, where we can provide students with opportunities to have more focused interactions where they can still approximate what they might have done in the classroom. Okay. Something that I encourage folks to consider more often is text chat. So I think we often think, oh, that can't be that helpful, but it actually can be extremely beneficial for learners. So text chat can take the form of, iMessage or Google Chat or Skype Chat or Zoom Chat, any of these things that allow for a synchronous exchange of ideas and language between learners. We see the same sorts of things in text chat that we see in face-to-face. Learners negotiate, they provide feedback, they discuss language, and an additional benefit is then they have a written record of their production. So they can actually go back and review either in real time or later as a secondary post activity that a teacher can do. And that increases opportunities for salience, so helping something stand out to learners, and increases opportunities for noticing, which also increases opportunities for development. So I would encourage teachers to think about the variety of opportunities for interaction. So it doesn't just have to be video chat, it can be synchronous text chat. There can also be collaborative writing opportunities. So something that a number of people have been doing for quite some time is having learners, interact synchronously on a Google document to collaboratively create something. Asynchronous communication also can be very beneficial. So encouraging discussion, on blogs or discussion boards, games, fan fiction, wikis. So wikis I know don't get used very much anymore, but there's a number of different technologies that I think we can better exploit in the classroom to give students different kinds of learning opportunities that are available to us through technology that maybe we didn't have the opportunity to use previously, but now, things have shifted. And so we maybe have some more room for exploration. Something as a caveat to put in, something that Marta Gonzalez-Lloret and Lourdes Ortega have talked about, as well as others, is that it's important for technology to be intentional. So for the technology to make sense as a part of the task, as opposed to just doing a face-to-face thing with technology. So I know that maybe that's not as relevant right now since everything is technology, just to because, but if and when, we go back to face-to-face and you still want to integrate technology into your classroom, kind of keeping that in mind that, we want the technology to make sense, to have that situational authenticity and to not be used just because it's technology, but because it makes sense within the task itself. So I mentioned earlier that Melissa Baralt and her colleague Juan Morcillo Gomez have an article that looks about how to use tasks in an online environment. I highly recommend it. They've got a great diagram, a figure based on Willis and Willis's framework, and they've adapted a task. It's kind of step-by-step. So it's a great example of what that can look like in a very accessible way. So I think that kind of returns also to our previous discussion. I think it's a great article because it's also aimed at practitioners and educators. And it's kind of like here's 10 things you can do to, I don't know if it's 10 things, but here's some things you can do to integrate, tasks into an online context. Some challenges for us to keep in mind, which I'm sure we've all experienced, are connectivity problems. So that's actually a big problem from here in Hawaii, is we actually have terrible internet where I am. And so that is something that has been a challenge. Fatigue. So I'm sure you all are feeling Zoom fatigue, and that's certainly a thing, right? It's not the same as being in person. And I know some places have like requirements for video, but then people are just completely, they're just exhausted. They just want to turn their video off and wear their pajamas. And, is that okay? And there's a whole slew of new things to consider in this kind of new environment. So something to keep in mind is building a community, which can be really challenging in an online course. And this was true pre-pandemic and will be true post-pandemic, is that when you have an online community or when you have an online course, we want to build a community, that feeling of community amongst our students. It's especially important when you're thinking about using tasks, because as we create these communicative, interactive opportunities, we want learners to feel that they can make mistakes and take risks with the language and try out things. And if they don't have that sense of community, they will be more hesitant to do those things. And then they'll kind of rob themselves of those developmental opportunities. So kind of some classroom community building can be important. Actually, Zoom, has kind of helped with that. So we were talking earlier about how we had a guest speaker recently at Hawaii who had to get up in the middle of her talk to let her dog out. And it was humanizing, right? We're like, oh yes, this is a real person with a dog and a house and a life. And so, I've had students, their cat will walk across in front of them while they're talking, right? I'm sure you guys have all seen this or maybe experienced it. My daughter has showed up randomly to classes. She'll just like magically appear over here occasionally. And so those are things that I think, we just kind of have to embrace with this current context and maybe even moving forward. I think these are good things. It helps us see that we're people and we get that community building that we would normally do in person, but this is kind of the way that we can do it because we are like in people's homes and in many ways more closely connected when we think of it like that, as opposed to meeting in a classroom. So there's some challenges, but I think some really interesting opportunities as well. So sorry, that was kind of like a very like windy answer to this question.
Yeah, but it's a complex situation. So, it matches the situation. And one of the things that you mentioned that was interesting is the idea of using more chat, message chat, text messaging basically, because, you know, another thing that that we should consider is that sometimes the students don't have a lot of access to technological tools. I mean, at least here in Brazil, if you look at public schools, there are many teachers who don't actually have the opportunity to be using breakout rooms or things like this, because, you know, the platforms, or even the students at home, they don't have like a computer or unlimited access to technology. But then if you think about WhatsApp, for example, here in Brazil, it's something that people are using all the time, and basically the majority of people have access to WhatsApp. So, you know, finding ways to not only be teaching the language and promoting interaction, as you said, but also building this community, which is so important in a moment like this, right? So very interesting.
Absolutely. So that's such a great, yeah, I forgot all about WhatsApp. You know, I mean, one of the things that this global pandemic has highlighted is the disparity in resources, and, you know, worldwide as well as within country, right? So that's been a big thing in the US is, you know, people are like shocked that not everyone has fast internet, but in most rural areas, people don't have good internet. And in some places, people have no internet or no computers. And, you know, but something like WhatsApp, most people have access to some type of cell phone, which in, you know, cell phones can text. And we have to think of ways that we can make our resources, or we can adapt the things we want to offer our students to the resources they have. And that's it also returns to our idea of social justice, right? And inequities, and you know, all of these things are interconnected. And when we're thinking about our students, you know, what do they have available to them, and how can we create rich learning opportunities for them in consideration of those resources and experiences? Yeah, thank you for suggesting those. Those are great ideas.
Okay, since we've been talking about challenges and possibilities, I would like now to move to the last question, at least from the list that we have prepared, and later we'll have questions from the audience. So we would like to refer here to Long's 2015 book in his concluding chapter, which is entitled Building the Road as We Travel. So he's talking about TBLT here. So if we think about this image of TBLT and as a field of knowledge that is in constant construction, and there's a lot to be done. So what do you think would be the fundamental bricks from now on?
So when I first read this question, I had to laugh, because if any of my students are watching this, they're going to know exactly what I'm going to say, because I'm sure Priscilla remembers me saying this all the time in class. More research, like more research is needed. So I really do believe, though, that the bricks, you know, the fundamental bricks of the foundation of our knowledge is research. And I don't mean that as like a throwaway term, but, you know, that's how we understand what's happening. And it doesn't just have to be, you know, empirical research or lab research or research done by people at universities. I think, you know, we can expand our ideas of what research means. And, you know, one of my colleagues, Dr. Betsy Gilliland, one of her areas is action research. And that is something that anybody can do. So, you know, doing research in your own classroom, and it's not informal research in the sense that, you know, there's not an experiment or an intervention necessarily, but you're reflecting, you're seeing what works, you're adapting. It's an iterative process, and you're asking questions in a systematic way that allows you to test hypotheses within the classroom and within your own practice. So I think, you know, as we move forward, you know, what we're building our knowledge on is our findings. And, you know, I refer to those as research findings, but, you know, they can also be based on teacher reflection and, you know, student reflection. And it can take many different forms, but as we increase our knowledge and our understanding of what and how tasks fit into our classrooms, then that allows us to continue, you know, building the road right as we go. And, you know, I'm curious to see where TBLT goes in these next 5 years. I mean, higher education, I'm not sure what it'll look like, you know, in a post-pandemic world. It'll be interesting to see what aspects remain, hopefully good ones, like the things we've talked about. Technology can provide connections that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to have. Like, for example, this talk, I might not have been able to come to Brazil personally, but here we are and we can have this wonderful interaction. Whereas before, these kinds of things maybe weren't at the forefront of our minds as opportunities because we were so used to doing things in a more traditional way. And so I hope, we see more opportunities like that remaining that help us to cast a wider net, that help us to expand our relationship between teachers and researchers, as we've talked about, helping to bridge that gap, to open those conversations, and to explore these new and interesting areas. So this is actually the shortest answer I have for everything, because I think it will be based on, the continued asking of questions and continued dialogue and sharing of knowledge. So I believe that is what our road will be built upon.
Mm-hmm. It's such an important answer, Nicole, because we are living in an era that scientific knowledge is not valid, at least in Brazil. This is kind of a trend nowadays. So, what you're saying, it's really important because it calls attention to the fact that we need to understand whatever we are doing as teachers from a scientific point of view as well, because this validates our work, right? And then another thing that you said that is really important is the idea that teachers can be conducting research themselves. You don't have to be a scholar, you don't have to be in the academia to be conducting research. In fact, as part of being a reflexive teacher, it has to do with conducting research, with understanding your classroom, understanding your practice. So thank you for this answer. It's really important. I guess we can move on to the questions from the audience. Yes? All right. So I think André is going to be, he has been collecting them and he's going to be reading them, and then we can go about answering.
I hope you're not just picking out like all the super hard ones.
We don't have many questions, but we have good questions here. The first question is, considering the pandemic context and the impact it will have in our lives in the next years, how do you think it will affect research in TBLT?
That's such a great question. And we sort of touched on that just briefly a few moments ago. I guess the short answer is, who knows? I think we'll see, of course, I think we'll see a greater interest in technology. So I mentioned earlier that pre-pandemic, there was, a handful of studies that looked at video chat and multimodal interaction. And I think we'll see much more research looking at what that is, because that's really the only kind of research we can do right now in most cases. Certainly here in my context in the US, I have PhD students. I'm adapting my own projects that had face-to-face components to now take place in a Zoom context or similar, multimodal context. So I think we'll see maybe a boom in technology-mediated TBLT, which to me, I think is a good thing, right? And as we were saying just a few moments ago, there are some great opportunities with technology. So maybe we'll see more exploration of these different frameworks that we talked about earlier and how, what they mean in technology-mediated contexts. Maybe we'll see more exploration of how, less understudied languages or underrepresented contexts, because now that sort of everyone is conducting research in the same format, we're all most of us are online. I mean, I know not everywhere is, but things are changing rapidly in terms of who's face-to-face in school and who's online. Maybe in some ways that creates more accessibility for some contexts that maybe wouldn't have had opportunities to collect data in a face-to-face context. Maybe they have an opportunity now to reach more students. So an example of that might be an instructor or a researcher that just works at a school with low enrollment, or with students, that are, we just don't reach that critical mass for maybe a quantitative study. So maybe we'll see more mixed methods research or more collaborations across universities or with teachers and researchers, using these connections that we have through technology to sort of expand our networks. So I know that's sort of like a little bit of, that's a very typical like teacher answer, right? Professor answer, where it's like, who knows, but maybe not. But I think I hope we'll see some really interesting expansion of these different connections and different environments both during and post-pandemic? Great question.
Thank you for your answer. The next question is more pedagogical. You talk about the frameworks that are more aligned with teacher context and others that aiming more explicitly at research investigation. Do you think that makes it more difficult for teachers to get closer to TBLT? Do you think we need more consensus about the theory in order to evolve in the practice or not? Are those two things separated or should remain that way?
Okay, I might have to have you reread that question after I get.
Yeah, we have many questions in the same one.
Great question. So let me tackle the theory aspect of that first. So theory development is something that I'm very personally interested in, and as I'm sure many of you know, you have learned about second language acquisition, SLA, and as you know from that field, we don't have one theory of language acquisition. And we have upwards of 60, depending who you ask, maybe more. And they're certainly not all in agreement. So one of the things I tell my students about SLA theories is that, they may not all be wrong, but they're certainly not all right, because some of them are in direct opposition to each other, where they both can't be true. It would be impossible for both to be true. So, but I don't think that's a bad thing. So I think, having, I think it was David Block that talked about letting all the flowers bloom. Right. So it's good to have different ideas, and as long as they're testable ideas. So kind of coming back to what Priscilla was saying, I do really believe, obviously, in the scientific method, and the US certainly is not at a very, we're not embracing science ourselves at the moment, unfortunately. I hope we're entering a new phase, but that's how we develop our knowledge. And so in terms of theories, I don't think it's a bad thing that we have multiple perspectives and multiple frameworks, because it allows us to investigate these different aspects of TBLT and maybe learn more about them from these different perspectives. And that's a good thing. So maybe when we frame our research in terms of, Ellis's framework as opposed to Robinson's framework, then we acquire different knowledge, which just helps deepen our understanding of what tasks can or cannot do in some cases. So I think that's good. I don't think we have to all agree on one approach to TBLT. And as Priscilla was mentioning earlier, one approach, it may not work, right? Big TBLT, where everything is very task-oriented, may not actually meet the needs of the students in some cases. So I think having multiple frameworks allows us flexibility, which is a good thing. And as long as we're approaching these frameworks from a grounded scientific perspective, also a good thing. Okay, so I don't see a downside there, right? It allows us to test and to investigate and to explore and to enhance our knowledge. All good stuff. Okay, I think another part of that question was, what was the first part?
Do you want me to repeat it?
Yes, can you repeat the question?
Okay, so do you think we need a consensus about theory in order to evolve in the practice or not? Are those two things separated or should remain that way?
Okay, so no, I don't think we need necessarily a consensus on how to, apply these things into the classroom. So sort of what we were talking about earlier, Virginia Samuda and Martin Bygate, often talked about these differences between task supported, task assisted, task based. With the aim, right, being that we want to integrate tasks as much as we can. So I don't think we have to have we don't want just one approach. I think that actually ends up giving us less options. So we want to be diverse and flexible in terms of, how these frameworks can be made more accessible. So that kind of goes back to what we talked about a little bit, how, you have something like Willis and Ellis, which I think are more readily brought into the classroom because they're more pedagogically oriented. And, the cognition hypothesis it's not to say it can't be brought, it absolutely can be brought into the classroom, but it's been mostly, looked at through research, like, laboratory or classroom research. So that doesn't mean it can't be brought into the classroom, but it returns to the question we talked about with teacher training, like how do we make these things accessible, and not just something like the framework, but how do we take our research findings and bring them into the classroom where teachers can see, okay, so here's what the cognition hypothesis says, here's the predictions. What does that look like in terms of a task? Like, what is a concrete example of a less complex and a more complex task, and a resource dispersing or resource directing manipulation? And providing that information, I think, is really important. So I don't think it's necessarily that frameworks can't be brought in. I think some maybe require more time investment to make them more accessible and to do so, but that's something that is important, because otherwise we are excluding those important resources from the classroom. And so it's a challenge for sure. And again, that's, you know, something that I'm trying to work on in creating a professional development, online accessible professional development course. So we can do exactly those kinds of things where we can have these conversations and help to bring these important research findings into the classroom more readily. Did I answer the question?
Yes, you did.
That was a great
Thank
question.
you
That was
very
really
much. It was a very good answer. Thank you. Considering that we have many teachers watching our conversation here, just to close, do you have any tips to teachers that want to start using TBLT in their classes? It's a very general question, but just to close the question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, you know, when we think about TBLT, right, and we think about language learning, so when I used to teach academic writing, and something that was really hard, academic writing is hard, right? It's hard for everybody. And one of the things I used to remind students is that no one's a native speaker of academic writing, right? We all have to learn it. And it's the same with like TBLT. We're not necessarily like native teachers to TBLT, but we are in some ways because we spend our whole lives doing tasks. And I think sometimes we forget that because we think about it in terms of language learning. But if you think about, you know, learning math or chemistry or learning to drive a car, we spend our whole lives doing tasks. So we actually have much more knowledge about this than you may realize. So in some ways, you all are experts at tasks already. So it's just thinking about, well, how do we create these optimal environments in the classroom? So for teachers who are interested in doing TBLT, one, you know, try and explore a little bit. So, you know, don't hesitate to take some risks, to try some things out. You have hypotheses about what will work in your classroom. There are a lot of resources available. So if you can spend some time thinking about, you know, what makes a task and what might that look like in my classroom, and then try it out. And, you know, don't be discouraged if things go wrong. So things go wrong for me all the time. You know, as a classroom researcher and as someone who has PhD students doing classroom research, I tell them that the one thing you can expect is the unexpected, right? So things will never go according to plan. And that's same for us as teachers in many ways, because we're working with humans, and humans, we are unpredictable, you know, rascally creatures that do very strange things sometimes, and that's okay. So, you know, you might end up spending a lot of time on a task and you think you have these really great instructions and it's really clear and you're imagining your students having this wonderful, rich interaction, and then they do something totally different and they completely undermine your entire plan. And that has happened to me so many times. You know, I piloted something and I'm like, oh, this research is going to be so good. And then I do it and they don't do what I expected at all. And that's okay. So my advice is that's okay. So things won't go as planned, and that's totally all right. That's to be expected. And that's a great opportunity to do some action research, to do some reflection, and to think about what you might change or do differently the next time. And that's totally all right. You can also feel free to reach out to people in the field. You're welcome to email me, of course. And I'm always happy to talk about TBLT. And, you know, it's not, well, it's like anything, right? It's the journey, right? It's the road. We're building the road. So expect that, you know, when you're building a road, there's going to be some potholes. I don't know. It's not a very good metaphor, but, and that's okay, right? So as you experiment, as you try things out, and like anything, the more you do it, the more comfortable you will become with that context. And so, you know, feel free to, you know, reach out to take advantage of those resources that are available, and to not put too much pressure on yourself, because it doesn't have to, there's no one way to TBLT, I guess I will say.
Yeah, I love that. I love the way you closed it, because this is something that we are always telling our students, you know, there's not one way, and that's good. It's a good thing, right? We have different ways of doing TBLT, and the idea is that we try and you know, see what happens and see how it happens in our context. So that's a very nice answer. That's a very good way to close this session of our event. Awesome. Do we have any more questions, André?
No, we don't. But I want to thank you, Nicole, for your answers, and to have you to be here today with us. We are very grateful.
Oh, no, it was my pleasure. And those were great questions. So I know, audience, I can't see you or anything, but those were wonderful questions. Thank you so much for asking those. I think those were really, really good ones for us to consider. So thank you.
So I guess this is the end of our event, right? We don't have anything else planned.
Yes, but I think we covered very important topics, and I would like to thank you so much for your availability, for waking up early to be here with us. I know it's early for you, and I'm sure there's a lot to talk about TBLT, and I think we have covered a lot, but we still know that there's a lot to be done, and that's good, right? Because it encourages us to continue working on this area, both in research and in our classes, our language classes. And I'm sure that your talk and the conversation we have engaged in will inspire other teachers to pursue even, I mean, not just research, but also pursue TBLT in their practices as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I hope so. This is something that resonated with me as a learner. So when I went to grad school and encountered this, and I was like, oh, interaction, this makes sense, right? And I really do believe that it's a wonderful pedagogical approach that gives our learners a lot of opportunities. And so I hope this has been helpful for everyone who attended. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for your excellent questions. And thank you, Leo and Priscilla, for the incredible questions that, I had to really spend a lot of time thinking about to prepare. So thank you. And for the wonderful discussion today. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
It was a great pleasure for us. It's always a pleasure to be learning from you. So a wonderful opportunity to be, having this chance again. So thank you very much for accepting, Nicole. And also, everything that you mentioned, as Leo said, it was definitely inspiring because, people who are here watching us are, interested in bringing theory into practice. And there may be people who say, oh, there's nothing else to be researching about the classroom. The classroom is, everything that's had to be said and research about the classroom is already done and research, but that's definitely not true.
No,
so
always more research, always more research.
Exactly. Thank you so much for everything that you shared with us and for being here. And thank you, the audience, also for, being here with us and also being the audience in one of the last event that we are promoting this year. We are going to be having more events next year. So, it was a great being with you all today. So I guess this is the end, and hopefully we'll be talking soon again.
I hope so. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
It was a great talk. Bye-bye. Thank you.